Okay, so now we are moving to dialogue. There's actually just a dialogue has a couple of conventions um, in how it's supposed to function. Okay, first of all, you don't have to write dialogue necessarily in the way that people really talk, right? If you go to a cafe or something and or I guess when you used to go to a cafe and you would listen to how people talk, there's like I'm doing it right now. These little conversational pauses, those conversational pauses don't usually need to make their way into dialogue. Um, Sometimes they might a little bit, but it's not. You're not looking for like perfectly replicated dialogue. Okay, so you have to kind of fake how people should talk rather than how people do talk. Okay, and um, the dialogue has to be pertinent to the story. You don't want to have people just kind of pointlessly talking unless it's serving the purpose of the story. Now, as a really quick, tiny suggestion, think of dialogue as a way of doing exposition. Okay? So if we have character A, character B, and blah, 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 these are dialogue marks. You can have character A, ask something about character B's history or past or beliefs or whatever's going to be important, for the character that you're focusing on. Um, Last year, or in 2016, didn't you vote for Donald Trump? Well, yeah, I did, but now I realize it was the biggest mistake of my life. I can't believe that I was stupid enough to vote for an obviously criminal charlatan. You see, that extends into the past. It's kind of like what we talked about with narration. It's a bit of a flashback. Okay. So that extends into B's past and actually allows them to develop a little bit. So we have B, they voted for Trump, but realized it was a mistake. Okay. So that starts to lend exposition instead of saying, in 2016, character B voted for Donald Trump. This stood as a great disappointment and mistake to, you see, that in terms of the narrative prose, okay, is a little bit flat. Okay. So if we do dialogue, that dialogue creates more of an interaction between the present and past. You can actually use it as a kind of flashback function. So that's something that I just recommend. Have the characters' dialogue mean something, and make it pertinent to the story. Use it to give exposition to your characters. For example, didn't you vote for Donald Trump in 2016? Absolutely, I voted for Donald Trump 16 in 2016. I'm going to vote for him in 2020 and 2024, right? That sorry, I had to embody for a moment a Trump voter. Um, you see, that's a different character arc, different character exposition. So, anyway, there's a couple conventions that we use in dialogue markers. These are what are called tags. Okay, this right here. She said, he said, she asked, he asked. These are called tags. And usually you want to tag dialogue, especially if you have several lines of dialogue on the page. Okay. Now you don't have to tag every single one unless you need it for clarity. Okay. Because if you said, blah, 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 B said, and then this is clearly somebody else. This is clearly A, and then this, and then this, and then this. You see, by the time you get down here, if you have a longer dialogue, it's really hard. You have to kind of count backwards to figure out, okay, who's talking right now? Who's doing what? So this little tag indication is actually pretty important. Now, if you said B said, A said, B said, A said, B said, A said, B said, A said, you see, that's going to get a little redundant. It's going to get a little overbearing. So you can leave them off sometimes, and that's fine. But just make sure that the reader can follow the dialogue and who's speaking. You don't have to use anything except said. if you're marking dialogue, said is just a standard in English. It's just a marker. Okay, you don't have to use different verbs. Blah 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 blah. She inquired. Blah 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 blah. She insisted. Blah 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 blah. You see, those verbs are fine once in a while, but this is pretty standard. Said and asked. They ask a question. Cool. They said something. Cool. Another thing up here, to avoid abusing adverbs. Blah 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 blah. She said sarcastically. She said forcefully. She said woefully. Okay, those adverbs are okay once in a while, but they're not really all that useful because the dialogue and the descriptions themselves around the dialogue tags should be indicating that it's said sarcastically or that it's said woefully. Okay. So that's pretty much all you really need to use for dialogue. Okay. Now, in terms of character, this is one of the most important parts, along with every other important part in fiction. But characters, because they're the vehicles that move the story along, right, are super important. Now, the one thing that you have to really get at is the idea of character development. We don't want our characters to be static. Okay, something in them moves them to action. Something around them moves them to action. Okay, get your characters out into the world. Have them face adversity of some sort. Establish that earlier in the story, and then the characters respond to that, and that will help to characterize them and make them into what E.M. Forster called round characters. Now, around characters, this is somebody whose psychology and motivations we either clearly see or can clearly guess at. They're nuanced. They have a past. They expect to have a future outside the boundaries of the story. Because I want you to think about it like this. Here's the story, right? The reader sees that character only in this brief span of time. Now that, in a 20-page short story, it could be a day, it could be a year, at most maybe a couple months, a week. But you see that character had a past, okay? And then we see them here, and they expect to have a future, right? So referencing things in the past, referencing things that have happened to them, becomes really useful. So that helps you to understand the character better, but it also helps to make the story more believable through a well-developed human-sounding character, okay? Flat characters are basically there to serve as, and I drew out here, almost like ping pong balls. Like if you imagine the character moving forward, right? X is doing something. Now, character Y doesn't have to be as well developed as character X. If this is your point of view character, character Y can be a flat character. It might be a coworker who asks them a couple questions, who engages in dialogue, whatever, that then, push them off to another character. Like, let's say character Z. Now, maybe character Z is a little bit more well developed. Maybe character Y, let's do something kind of cheesy. Let's do office worker. Okay, he works at an office. He meets his new coworker, character Y. Right, she's a little flat at first. Okay, let's say that he has a crush on her. Right, meets her, falls head over heels in love. Why not? Then he goes home to his wife, character Z. Now, Z is going to be a little bit more developed here, okay, because clearly he has a lot more emotional involvement and time involvement with character Z. So she says, "You look strange today. What happened? Are we still going to the beach this weekend? Go help little Billy with his homework." And character X says, "Oh no, now I have a moral conundrum. I have a family life, but I really am thinking about character Y." He goes back to work the next day. Now we might find out a little bit more about character Y because character X is engages her more, right? He's kind of talking more about her. Then all of a sudden, here comes, um, I don't know, his sister. You know, he's out at the beach. His sister joins him. His wife walks away to go get a soda, and his sister says, you look troubled. What's wrong?" And he says, "Oh boy, I've been thinking about character Y, and so you see that it's like this character X here is constantly just bouncing off of all these other characters. Now these don't have to be super well developed characters. We don't need to know everything about them. We need to know as much about this character, a point of view character, as is necessary for the story. We need to know only as much about these characters as is important to push that character through the story. Okay? And that's basically how characters move through stories. Okay? Now, one quick little thing, just to mention this. Very often, characters can be defined, or at least you can get a sense of them through what's called amartya. It's translated into English like this. They often, when you have a vowel in Greek and it's translated into English, very often they add an H to it. Why? I don't know. But this is actually sometimes translated as a character's flaw. Like a character will have one fatal flaw to them, okay? And that helps to set up the character arc. It helps to create a sense of plot, right? But it also gives you kind of a direction, right? Like let's say character X's fatal flaw is that I don't know. Let's say he's a serial cheater, okay? Not terribly interesting as a character, but, this is just a generic example. So that character flaw is going to clearly indicate, something's going to happen with Y. It's going to complicate things with the wife. It's going to give his sister an even lower opinion of him, okay? And eventually, it ends up in divorce. Or maybe, in terms of rebirth, remember our plot type? Maybe it ends up that he realizes the mistakes that he made and does not do this and renews his vows with his wife and lives happily ever after. In any case, the hamartia is meant to serve as a kind of guiding point, okay? Like a direction that you're going to aim that character in. Don't give them too many flaws, but they should have a couple, okay? Because, think about it like this. Human beings are all flawed. Right? We're all just messes, right? Human beings are going to empathize and sympathize with characters through their flaws more than they will through their virtues. It's not to say that we don't have virtues and characters can't have them, but rather it's much easier to humanize a character through their flaws than it is to characterize them through virtue, okay? You can see this in a lot of like modern comic book movies, right? Iron Man, for example, just to kind of throw this out. Iron Man in the original comics was brilliant. Tony Stark was a brilliant businessman, scientist, etc. His amartya was he was an alcoholic, right? So he's constantly in like the 1970s and 80s in the older comics, he was wrestling with alcoholism, right? He was wrestling with the demons. Okay, so these little flaws in your characters, okay, will help us to understand them better. It'll help to maybe create empathy a little more strongly. It's just a very useful thing to think about. Amartya technically in Greek means not so much flaw. It can mean this, but it actually just means mistake. So your character's making mistakes. Because all of us make mistakes, and all of us have the choice thereafter, do we learn from them, or do we not learn from them, okay? So it can mean both. Either way, I think it serves as an example of how to think about characterizing the people in your stories. Okay. Um, Now, like for example, I mentioned Othello, right? His amartia was jealousy, right? You might say that Desdemona, his wife, her amartia was her commitment to Othello, her love for him. Um, if we go back to the Iliad, written by Homer, Achilles' uh, character flaw, his wrath, with Odysseus. His flaw was his pride, right? And Achilles' wrath and Odysseus' pride get them into trouble. Okay, so they have these strong character traits that push them through the story, and there is a resistance to that. The story or the plot pushes back on them. Now, the thing that I want you to see is that if you think of an arch, okay, think of an arch. And if we have plot on one side and we have character, it's kind of hard to write with this. Right? These are leaning on each other, okay? And if you take one of them out, if you take out, a strong plot, it falls over. Like the story, if you think about this as the structure of the story, it falls over. Character and plot, because what the characters want, okay, how they are, is necessarily resisted by the plot, okay? Things happen to them that complicate the things they want, okay? And then that is the constant kind of tension through the story. It's, I think I'm going to do this, and I'm setback. Think about this, setback. Think about this, complication. Think about this, tension. And then you have the choice toward the end of the story. Do they win or do they lose? Okay? It's usually better that they lose. It's usually more interesting. But you see, this is kind of how character functions, okay, or how it ought to function. Now, I mentioned exposition and backstory. Like I said, most of the time with your characters, you don't have to give all their entire life story, okay? You can use dialogue, you can use flashbacks to give a little bit of their backstory, but really we're focused on the present. This is the cumulative essence of who they are. Okay, and that pushes them through the story. What do they want? The moment you figure out what they want, then you know what kind of plot you're going to put into complicated. If they want love, all right, we've got a romance plot, a love plot, and it's going to be much harder for them to find love, right? They're going to have to earn it. Okay, and that sense of earning things in a story is what gives readers satisfaction, right? It's not so much that the good guy wins and the bad guy loses, but rather that there's a struggle during the movie in which there are sacrifices made, things lost, but ultimately the end result is that the character, whoever wins or loses. Okay, so that all functions all together. So just think of dialogue and flashback as the main way to get exposition into your stories. Setting is clearly important. As with setting, it's fairly easy to understand, but it's really something that comes down to time and place. Okay, if we set, let's say, our story in the Bahamas in 2020 versus the Bahamas in, let's say, 1953. Right? That's a 9. The temporal setting itself is going to give different context. Okay, now in certain cases, you don't necessarily need to explain everything about that time and place setting. Very often, the default, like if you don't describe time and place, okay, the default will be to the present wherever the reader is. Okay, so you usually want to give some indication where it's taking place, some indication, maybe if you think it's necessary, time. Okay, like if you're writing a historical novel or a story, then it's clearly time is important. Now, this is simply just something that I suggest. On the first page or two, at least give a gesture or a nod as to where and when. Okay. Um, Character X walks outside. My goodness, it was only 2 years ago. My goodness, 2018 was only 2 years ago, and I can already tell that this summer is going to be way worse. I hate climate change, right? So we get a little bit of a gesture at time. He looked around. The palm trees all around Nassau seemed brown, sluggish, and dull, barely moving in the hot summer afternoon. Okay, very quickly, just time, place. Okay. Point of view is important, and this is not about your point of view character, but the point of view of the narration itself. There's two basic conventions in fiction. That is to say, he, she, it, and they, so they went to the store. It was a dark and stormy night. She picked up a hammer and hit him over the head. So there's this. This is called third person. Okay, this is he, she, or she, he, or it. The other one is called first person. Now, this is a story told from the perspective of an I. Okay, I did this, I did that. I picked up the hammer and hit him over the head because it was a dark and stormy night. My recommendation, and this isn't a rule, but I do strongly suggest it, is to actually write all of your stories for about 2 to 3 years in third person. It's much easier to control, and it actually kind of helps to distance the characters from you, the writer. The problems that I see in first person are this. Very often, because we're narrating somebody's thoughts, right? Because we can see their thoughts, because they're the viewpoint character. We see a lot of them thinking and just thinking and wondering and remembering stuff. And it actually kills a lot of the action. Now, the action is what actually moves the story forward, right? So in that sense, I think first person is actually kind of harder point of view to work with than third person. Third person is a little bit more objective. It actually, I think, is a little bit more dynamic. There's a lot more possibilities with third person. So that's just a polite recommendation. And with third person, you can have what's called omniscient or omniscient limited. Sorry, there should be. Limited omniscient. Limited omniscient is this. Okay. So in limited omniscient, third person, we can see her thoughts and what she says, right? So we can see her thoughts. Maybe she says, "Oh, I'm in love with him," and she's our point of view character, okay? If he's our secondary character, right? In limited omniscient, we would only see her thoughts, her actions, her words. We don't see his thoughts, okay? We can see his words, I love you too. Oh, how nice. But he can't think this. Oh, he's so dreamy. I love him so much. And if we saw his thoughts, that would technically be a point of view shift, okay? So we don't want to see other characters' thoughts. We only want to see our point of view characters. Now, he can say things out loud, okay? That's how we know what he's thinking. That's why dialogue actually becomes pretty important. Now, there's something called third person totally omniscient, which is where we would see everybody's thoughts. This is really hard to control because very often, if you think she's your point of view character, very often authors, if they're not in total control of the story, they'll make other characters the point of view character. So it just switches around too much. So if you're going to do third, I would do limited omniscient. Here, first person is simply too subjective. Okay, there's a good and a bad quality to this. It's not that you can't do it. It's just that I recommend you do third. Okay, when you choose one point of view, third person, first person, choose one and don't deviate from it. I sometimes see authors they'll switch. Like so we have the point of view character from first person, and sometimes the authors will switch to third in the middle of the story. That's just something to watch out for. The last and most important part of all literature, all fiction especially, is what I call, or not what I call, what the Greeks called agon. Okay. Now you can see this agon in our words like protagonist, agony, for example, which actually doesn't mean agon here. Agon is tension, danger, and suspense. These are crucial in the story. Now, by danger, like I said, I don't mean, a guy with a chainsaw running after somebody in the woods. It could be psychological danger, emotional danger, career danger, whatever. Okay, suspense, tension. Just think of every scene in your stories. Okay, scene to scene to scene, building tension on that character. Okay, building a sense of danger. Character X goes to the grocery store. He is really hungry and has forgotten his wallet. Okay, there's some tension. It's not huge. Okay. And suspense. What's he gonna do? He gets to the grocery store and he says, "Oh, man, I'm really hungry. I've never stolen anything in my life. Why not this time?" Okay. He steals some candy. Okay. Now he tries to get out of the store. Tension, danger, suspense. What's gonna happen? Well, maybe in sense of suspense, he gets out, no problem. Well, what does that then do? It creates in him, okay, now I'm going to start stealing. Stealing's easy. Okay, wow, I don't have to pay for anything. And you see, what you're doing in this is you're constantly kind of building, right, tension. You're constantly just trying to up the pressure on the characters so that by the end, they have there's some sense of danger hanging over them. If we think back to the character falling in love with his office worker or whatever, right? Clear tension, clear suspense, because we might want to read on and see, like, okay, well, what is he gonna do it? Is he gonna cheat on his wife? And if he does, what's the danger? That she'll find out and do what? Divorce him. Okay? Or that she'll find out and go have an affair of her own. So you see, there's all kinds of different ways that you can build tension in stories. That depends on where you want to take it. But always think from scene to scene to scene of building tension, even if it's a little bit of tension. Okay? It's not that the character, wakes up, gets a call from the doctor who says, "Oh, you got cancer." Oh, goodness, he's driving to work or he's driving to the hospital and gets in a car wreck. And then he's in a coma for a month and he wakes up just in time to die. Oh, you see, that's ridiculous. That's melodramatic. Okay? So you have to kind of control this. It can't be chainsaws in the woods all the way through the story. You have to give the reader a kind of moment to just take a breath, right? You have to take a moment to calm down, just like you would need, right, after something scary happened. You kind of like, whoa, let me think about that for a minute. So too with the characters in the stories. So too with the readers. Okay. Yeah. So it's. I think I did this. I should have alluded to my wonderful drawing. It can't just be that, the character goes through the story, goes through all these ups and downs, and then all of a sudden dies at the end of the story, right? I have that. I'll see that a lot, and it never ever works in fiction. It's the same thing like this. So the character goes through the story, all this stuff happens, and then he wakes up at the end of the story and realizes, oh, that was all a dream. We see, what does that do? It removes all the danger and tension and struggle. Because if it's just all a dream, well, then what's the point, right? So in this sense, we want the characters to go through trial. We want them to go through error. We want them to go through struggles. We want them to go through interesting and difficult times. Because if they don't, and they just kind of, they just, everything's fine and nothing happens and whatever, so then we're not telling a story, right? We want our characters to struggle. We want our characters to have bad days so that by the end of their story, right, they can look at the accomplishments that they've made, notice sad and happy, right? So that their happiness is earned, is deserved, okay? And that's really important for telling stories. Now, like I said, stories are basically life with the boring stuff removed, okay? We have to streamline our stories to make them compelling. But adding tension to the stories that we're telling will almost always help to make them engaging, help to put tension and suspense and danger on top of the character, okay? Now, and then combine that with a good plot, good characterization, interesting setting, interesting point of view. All of the elements that we talked about today put together will help to make your stories just a little bit better in first, second, third drafts. And then after a couple years of writing, your first drafts will become so much better as they are as first drafts. Okay. So anyway, that's a kind of brief kind of sketch of some of the stuff that we look at in fiction. I might do a little talk on irony, and just so you can kind of understand how irony functions, because irony is a very important literary technique that's actually really easy to miss if you don't know what you're looking for. So maybe I'll do a little talk on irony here in a bit and get you caught up with that. But these are the things I want you to think about in terms of fiction and fiction writing, so you can use these to analyze other stories, to analyze each other's stories, and to analyze your own. So, thanks.